Okay, so this is going to be an online lecture that you can watch before we have our first discussion. And it's going to be a little informal, but the task for the quarter, as we've laid out, is to examine spending on behalf of endangered species and assess why it is that so few species seem to come off the endangered species list. So this was stimulated by, yet again, conservative voices saying that the endangered species list is Hotel California. You can enter, but you can never leave, and feeling frustrated at the regulatory burden and the cost and the imposition it puts on private landowners. And so we wanted to dig into this a little deeper. And I've had a long history of working in this realm. Looking at a paper I wrote in 2008, I wrote a paper about the Endangered Species Act, and in it I had assessed the expenditure data from 2004 to show how highly skewed the expenditures were on endangered species. So it says in my paper, in this 2008 paper, that the top 100 most funded species garnered 89% of all the funding, and that the bottom 478 species, that's roughly a little bit a third, or between a third and a quarter, garnered about $5,000 per species. And you think, well, $5,000, what do you do with $5,000? This is really just administrative costs of some staff keeping track of the species. No one's actually doing anything for those species at all. And this is a really strong difference between the highly funded species and the poorly funded species. Well, many years has gone by. 2004, that's 20 years ago. We can look at that data. The Fish and Wildlife Service publishes these data every year, and the short story is that that funding pattern hasn't changed. But there's no reason to expect that all endangered species cost the same amount of money to recover. So a lot of those, all those, I'll tell you in advance, that all those species that are really highly funded are salmonids, and they all are funded by money that's generated from dams, and they're all impacted by those dams. And so the money from the dams that is generated that impacts them is used to run fisheries, fish hatcheries, and do other recovery programs. And that a lot of species don't get very much money at all. And if we don't pay for anything, then we can't expect that we'd actually magically recover species that are threatened, unless there's a driver, an external driver that we stop. And so evaluations of the Endangered Species Act has pointed to those 78 or so species that were on the list when the act was passed in 1973. There was an Endangered Species Preservation Act in 1966, which listed some species before there was an ESA. And a lot of those species were things like peregrine falcons and bald eagles and brown pelicans that were having eggshell thinning problems with DDT, and the cessation of the use of DDT in the US really led to the recovery of those species. And so they didn't necessarily need a lot of funding, although those three species did get a lot of funding. But anyway, so that's the task. But I have a deeper goal for you for the quarter, and that's just really to develop a deeper understanding of the Endangered Species Act. And so I wanted to spend some time today talking about that and giving you some background on the Endangered Species Act. So this is a fantastically long book, but it's a detailed book by Douglas Brinkley called The Silent Spring Revolution. And what it's really doing is looking at the politics from the Kennedy administration through the Nixon administration, what he calls the long 60s, and how impactful that was for the environment. And, Silent Spring was the book written by Rachel Carson, a scientist, about DDT and how it was killing all these insects and other animals and harming birds, and was very influential in the administrations of Kennedy and Johnson and then Nixon. But there's a lot about that's interesting in this. It's really fascinating history, and I find it particularly interesting because I was a child during this time. The Endangered Species Act was passed, signed by Richard Nixon at the end of 1973. I was 14 years old. 15 years. No, 14 years old. And anyway, so let's put this into some context. So starting in the early 60s, Stuart Udall, who's from, I think he was a governor, maybe he was a senator from Arizona, was appointed the Secretary of Interior under John F. Kennedy, and he really worked John F. Kennedy to get him out to Yosemite and Yellowstone, and Kennedy was a big sailor off the Atlantic coast in Boston, and sort of Udall made that connection between what Kennedy loved to do and the analogous bits over the rest of the country. And so Kennedy became an advocate for the Wilderness Act, and he started designating things like national seashores that hadn't been in existence before. Well, we all know Kennedy met an untimely death early on, or halfway through. He was just starting to think about re-election, and all of a sudden Johnson becomes president. Well, Johnson, considerably more conservative person, part of the old staid Democratic Party, but he owned a ranch in West Texas or outside Austin in the hill country, and really viewed himself as an outdoors person. And even though everything you see about Johnson, he was a very buttoned down guy, and Kennedy would hold press conferences outside and demonstrate how he was an outdoorsman, Johnson did everything inside the office. But in fact, he deeply cared about the environment, and his wife, Lady Bird Johnson, did as well. Lady Bird Johnson was instrumental in getting Redwoods National Park, the expansion of Point Reyes, and other things. And Lyndon Johnson continued Kennedy's legacy of designating national seashores and the Wild and Scenic River Act, and pushing clean water and clean air. This was the Great Society, was the label of his presidency. And he was really saying it was time for America to be a great society, and that all this post-war expansion was great. The economy was booming, but we really needed to tend to things that were of human interest. And that included things like civil rights and urban development and more than just the environment. Well, so in 1968, Johnson doesn't run for re-election. Nixon wins by a long shot. And so we now have a conservative president. And so what do we think is going to happen? Well, it turns out that Nixon probably the environment wasn't the top on Nixon's list. He was really interested in issues associated with the Cold War, backing out of Vietnam and ending that the Johnson administration had been pushing quite vigorously. And so he's doing environmental legislation. I think that the Wilderness Act was signed when Johnson was president, but Nixon becomes president in '68, and the Clean Water Act and the Clean Air Act both signed under Nixon. And then eventually Nixon's worrying about re-election. There's the Watergate scandal. The Watergate scandal breaks in June of '72, but Nixon actually pushes the Endangered Species Act and wants Congress to take a step on this, and Congress does, and it passes by I wrote it down someplace here. I don't remember where I put that down, but it was like 350 to 10 in the House, and was passed unanimously in the Senate. And it was signed, and that was in September, October of '73. Or '72 rather, and signed into law in December of '72 to take effect in January of '73. And then, the Nixon administration was undergoing all sorts of scandals, and Agnew had resigned in '73, I think, and then Nixon resigns in '74. So in the midst of this Watergate scandal, the Endangered Species Act passed. And it was largely written by a guy named Russell Train, who was a lawyer in the Nixon administration, who was a founder of the World Wildlife Fund before he became administrator for Nixon, and subsequently went on to be the director of the Environmental Protection Agency, but well steeped in the conservative milieu of the 1970s. He was not a liberal, but he did a really amazing job of thinking of creating an Endangered Species Act that really had an ethical statement that basically says it's wrong for us to knowingly cause the extinction of species, and that's the basis of the Endangered Species Act. It's right there in the first paragraphs. That we're going to try hard, and that money shouldn't be a reason. We can make more money doing this if we get rid of the species, or if that species becomes a byproduct of economic growth. He said that's not okay. We have to make a serious effort to protect a species. And I think that one of the retrospective arguments about the Endangered Species Act is that no one ever thought it was going to be all these little plants and insects and the thousands of species that it's turned out to be, that people had envisioned that this was just going to be the few hundred species, the eagles and the peregrine falcons and the brown pelicans and the grizzly bears and the wolves and the things that are iconic, and that the purview of the ESA has expanded way out beyond its intent. Well, that's maybe a little bit of revisionist history. That somewhere around 1973, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service was asked to report how many species did they think needed to be listed because they were actually endangered. And their answer came back around 4,000 or 5,000. And there's 1,500 or 1,600 species on the endangered species list. We've never achieved actually listing all the species that are genuinely endangered. Another sidebar associated with the Endangered Species Act that's important to bear in mind is that it was passed at about the same time that the international body passed, and this became a global treaty that countries were supposed to pay attention to. That's the Convention on the International Trade in Endangered Species. And so one of the features of the Endangered Species Act, the U.S. Endangered Species Act, is that it's a way to put into law how we're going to assist the world in the trade in endangered species. And so things like elephants become listed under the U.S. endangered species list as international endangered species, because that way we can regulate ivory moving in and out of the country, or caviar from endangered sturgeon moving in and out of the country. That if it's on our endangered species list, you can constrain the capacity of people to bring those endangered species from other countries into this country, either live or dead. And what's growing out of that is that we now have, and have had for 50 years, a funding mechanism through the Fish and Wildlife Service to send international aid through Fish and Wildlife Service funds to other countries in support of endangered species that are not on U.S. soil. A former student from here, Matt Muir, who lives in Anchorage, is one of the program officers for this international program, and they're deep into evaluation of whether the money that they spend is actually demonstrably helping the species that they're trying to help. But that's a story for another day. Anyway, so that's sort of the background of the Endangered Species Act. But I'll show a graphic in here that the Endangered Species Act, when it was passed, was mostly vertebrates, and it was mammals, fish, and birds. And slowly but surely through the 70s and 80s, it became dominated by plants. And now plants represent the largest taxonomic group of species listed under the Endangered Species Act. And insects are up there as well. If we actually honestly listed all of the insects that we think are endangered, they would outnumber the plants for sure. But they don't get on the endangered species list that often. And it was really as the list became dominated by species no one's ever heard of that political pushback came. And even though one of the curious attributes about the Endangered Species Act is it's way less powerful in protecting plants than it is animals. And there's a law legacy that explains that, and that is most of our laws are based on English laws. And if you remember Robin Hood, that Robin Hood got in trouble for shooting the king's deer, that animals, by virtue of the fact that they can pass freely from one person's property to another person's property, are not under the ownership of the property owner. They're a property of the state. And so the state has the authority to regulate whether we can shoot deer or swat mosquitoes. They exercise that right for things like deer, but not for mosquitoes. So, but we, as a landowner, we don't own the animals on our property. They come and go. And that the implication there is that we, as private landowners, have or carry some responsibility to the common good for those animals. And that's different for plants. Plants are rooted on your property, and as a consequence, you own the plant that's on property that you own. And so the federal government has a very constrained capacity to protect endangered plants. So most of the endangered plant activity really involves public lands where the federal government can do active habitat restoration or things like that. Now, just a little aside that California has many states have an Endangered Species Act, and California has one. And in California, the California states that the state owns the plants as well. And I don't know that it's ever been challenged in court, but that we ostensibly here in this state claim greater authority over the capacity to regulate endangered plants. So back to my story, I have an acquaintance, a friend, I guess. Her name is Connie Barlow. She's the head of the Trea Guardians, and early in my career, I was working on Trea taxifolia, endangered tree of North Florida, and the Tree Guardians started this program to save the species from extinction by moving it outside its historic range. And so this is something that would be absolutely illegal to do with an animal, but isn't with a plant, because if you have legally obtained propagules and you put them on private property with the permission of the landowner, even though it's an endangered species, you haven't violated any laws, even though you might violate good ecological management principles. So this was that Connie and I got into a series of arguments over this, because they were moving this as a means to help protect the species from extinction, because within its native range it has a plant disease and it's not doing very well and it's declining slowly towards extinction. My argument was that it is declining slowly towards extinction, that it's in botanic gardens, and we have plenty of time to study the disease, look for solutions within its historic range. We don't have to go full nuclear and move it outside and into other ecosystems yet. And so over the years, we've debated this issue, and we agree to disagree on this. But she's been very forthright and forthcoming and public about their actions. And as a consequence, I think she's really daylighted this idea of whether we should be managing species by moving them outside of their range in response to things like climate change. And I think that's been very helpful to the discussion of assisted migration and what kinds of policies we should have pertaining to those. So that also is largely a study, a story for another day. But we talk a bit, and if you look at Wikipedia on the Endangered Species Act, you'll notice that the entry is remarkably long. It goes on and on and on. And that's mostly Connie's fault, that she's become a Wikipedia author and she's done a lot of editing of the Wikipedia page, and she doesn't do anything in a small way. So if you look at Tree Guardians, their website, it seems very wordy and long, and the same is true with her entries into the Endangered Species Act part of a Wikipedia page. But she claims, and from personal experience, and some serious personal experience, that the worst thing you can possibly do to a plant is put it on the endangered species list, because then it has all this regulatory crap that goes along with it, and that it makes it harder to do good things for the species, because it prevents well-intentioned private citizens from taking action, and the bureaucratic morass of the Fish and Wildlife Service and the federal government means that nothing gets done. States don't take responsibility, and so it's really up to private citizens, and the listing of species really is a buzzkill for private citizens taking actions. So that's her opinion. And I don't entirely agree with that, obviously, but it's an interesting perspective. And so I think it's a thing we ought to think about. And so back to the whole idea of expenditures, is that if our task is to take the expenditure data over a longer period of time, and I've decided 15 years and they haven't published the expenditure data since 2020, and I don't know why. I keep asking the person who's in charge of this for the Fish and Wildlife Service, and she says, "Don't give up. We'll get it out there," but it hasn't appeared. So I don't know when that will come out. But if you take the 15 years leading up to 2020, so 2006 to 2020. You get a lot of expenditure data, and the Fish and Wildlife Service over that period has become better and better about reporting that data. You get the same pattern that I got from the 2004 data, but you do find that some species go high and go low in individual years. But the other thing that's really changed, two other things have really changed about endangered species reporting since that 2008 paper, is that recovery plans are much more explicit about the potential cost, or the estimated cost to recover a species, and what that cost would go for. And so you can look at how much is being spent on behalf of a species relative to what we think the cost of saving that species is going to be. The other thing that's really changed is that the Fish and Wildlife Service now posts a report on implementation progress. And so you can see, well, what's gotten done. Now, it's a little bit sad, because almost everything is listed as either not started or in progress, and very few things are completed. But then they separately list expenditures that include habitat acquisition, and habitat loss is the greatest threat to the most number of species, and so that's an important thing to think about. But then also other activities that they do. And so our goal, I think, is to look at that expenditure data, and basically I think we will confirm the obvious, that there's just not enough money going towards endangered species to actually recover any substantial number of them. And that if you took the amount of expenditures and extrapolate that out over time, you might predict that you'd recover species sometime in a couple centuries from now, rather than any time in the foreseeable future. And yet we know that costs keep going up, and so that's probably even an underestimate of recovery. So what should we do? And since habitat loss is the primary driver of threat for many, many species, habitat acquisition is the obvious answer. And yet clearly in this country, we've reached some sort of threshold of public or private landowner tolerance for sweeping lands from the private sector into the public sector, that there's a general sentiment that there's enough land in the public sector, and that if people want to conserve land, it ought to be paid for by the people who want that. And so, easements and land trust easements are increasingly a way that habitat is protected. And yet easements are a funny way of protecting things. They don't always afford a lot of a protection for particular species. They're very variable, and they're not always directly at conservation of biodiversity. I mean, you have agricultural land easements that basically stipulate that the land has to stay in agriculture, not necessarily saying anything about biological diversity or the management thereof. So, what to do about our biodiversity, given that we have a constraint of how much more land we're likely to put into a conservation portfolio, and some obvious threats. It's not an easy solution. And I think one of the things that we might want to do is separate our consideration of terrestrial species from aquatic species. So there's a lot of really dramatic impacts to rivers and streams and lakes, and that as a fraction of the total number of species in the species pool, aquatic species are more highly endangered than terrestrial species. And we might think about how we protect species on land as a habitat acquisition, habitat protection, habitat management problem, separate from how we protect things in aquatic systems, because that's often a non-point source pollution, industrial pollution management, and water management issue, and thinking about things like dams. And so there's more of a opportunity for public action to improve aquatic species, but there's probably also greater threats to getting that done, because you have the dams for reasons and put fertilizers on farmland for a reason, and so they create impacts that are hard to redress. Okay, so that's about a half an hour of rambling on the Endangered Species Act. I'll put this into a little thingy and put up a couple graphics to illustrate a couple points, and I'll build on this a little bit more with some more details about what I think we can be doing. But that's basically a little primer on the Endangered Species Act and why it's important. I mean, it's often cited as the granddaddy of environmental legislation, and it passed in 1973, about the same time as CITES. It's certainly been used internationally as a model for how you protect biodiversity, and is still thought of as the gold standard of environmental regulation. Yet it clearly has a limited capacity to be effective, and has run into a wall of how it's going to be effective in the future. And that's what we want to, that's the broader issue of what we want to think about. So through this quarter, we have this task that is kind of narrow and constrained about looking at expenditures and where that money goes, and how endangered species are responding to that. But I think we always ought to be thinking in the back of our minds of how do you move beyond that. Well, I'll just go on for another 5 minutes or so on this. Several years ago, the Alex Camacho at the UC Irvine, who's now moved to UCLA, and his law school did an evaluation of the Endangered Species Act and thought about how to make it more effective. And another person about the same time wrote an article called the ESA at 60, sort of looking out in the future. And in both those cases, they said, really, we need to strengthen the Endangered Species Act. We need to give it real teeth. And one of the attempts to do that was by the Center for Biological Diversity about a decade ago, when they tried to argue that energy companies needed to ask for a take permit for polar bears because of climate change. Greenhouse gases were warming the Arctic and removing habitat for the polar bears and causing further endangerment. And when you cause further endangerment of an endangered species, that requires a take permit. And they lost that argument in the courts. And I kind of think, thank God they did, because I think if they actually had won, that would be the end of the Endangered Species Act, that there's a limit to what we can do and push before public sentiment turns against endangered species. And I think that that's been missing in this argument. So the Irvine conference, a bunch of lawyers there from Defenders of Wildlife and various law schools, and they both mostly put forth arguments of how you add those teeth to the regulatory teeth to the Endangered Species Act. And you see the general deregulatory fervor of the United States and just think, is that going to go well for the Endangered Species Act? I'm not so sure it would. And so I think actually it's my opinion that the future of the Endangered Species Act as a successful piece of legislation is to increase the funding toward it and put more of that funding into private landowner agreements to make it more financially feasible for private landowners to do the right thing. That there is a saying called shoot, shovel, and shut up, and it was first referred to, I think, with spotted owls, but then also red-cockaded woodpeckers. This idea that if you own habitat for, say, the red-cockaded woodpeckers, the last thing you want to do is allow your longleaf pine to get large enough that they have cavities that red-cockaded woodpeckers can nest in, because you want to make sure they never get on your property. And that's not very conducive to protecting red-cockaded woodpeckers. And so the idea is that private landowners are very, very worried about having occurrences of endangered species on their property. And I think if you change the nature of how funding went for endangered species, and that more of it went to private landowners to help species, there are already things in the legislation like the North Surprises Clause and the conservation agreements with assurances that allow landowners to improve their habitat for endangered species and not suffer increased regulatory burdens as a consequence of that. So if you had habitat with one pair of red-cockaded woodpeckers and you manage to change your habitat so now there's 20, that the Fish and Wildlife Service won't hold you responsible for 20 into the future. It's basically a means for fostering private participation. And I think that the future of a successful future of it for the Endangered Species Act is one where we make private participation more appealing. And that's where I'll stop rambling for today. Thanks.